Hey there everyone, welcome back to our channel. I'm Brendan Hines, the founder and audio engineer at TRPTK, and today we're diving into a highly debated topic in the audio world. Do audio cables actually make a difference? So we recently conducted this test to settle the age-old argument once and for all. We've asked you to participate by listening to samples that we recorded using different analog microphone cables and share your thoughts on them. And the response has been overwhelming, and we can't wait to share the results with you. So let's jump right into it. Before we begin, we want to make a couple of disclaimers first. We believe in transparency and want to assure you that this test is completely unbiased. So 2 pairs of the cables that we used in the test were generously provided by Furatech in Japan and Pure Cable in the Netherlands. But these companies were not involved in the test itself or in the outcome. This video is completely independent of any influence from any manufacturer. Now secondly, it's also really important to note that this test is not meant to be a definitive answer to all cable comparison tests. Our goal was just to conduct a basic test to determine if changing the microphone cables around in our specific recording system would result in an audible difference to our listeners. We'll dive deeper into the recording system that we use later on in the video, but for now, let's focus on the basics. Thirdly, we're specifically comparing analog microphone cables in this test, so we won't be discussing digital cables or power cables. Our focus is on relatively low-level microphone signals and their analog transmission. Lastly, it's really crucial to understand that this test is not scientific by any means. It's a practical and a subjective listening test. We could have included more detailed measurements and graphs and technical data, but we wanted to keep things accessible and pragmatic for everyone, including ourselves and you, the listener. So now that we've addressed those important points, let's move on to the details of how the test was conducted. For this test, we used 2 spaced arrays of Josephson C617 microphones with Gefell measurement capsules. They're omnidirectional and they have this completely flat frequency response from 3.5 Hz to 20 kHz and have an extremely low noise floor as well. So they're really detailed and accurate, which is really important for what we do. We positioned these arrays right next to each other as close as we could get them in their own shock mounts. Moving on from the microphones, the signal travels to our preamplifier, the Grace Design M801 Mark II. We connect the microphones to the preamp using 2 different pairs of microphone cables, which we'll discuss soon. These Grace Design preamps have an impressive frequency range, exceptionally low noise and distortion, and each channel is precisely matched with the rest of the unit, ensuring minimal discrepancies. From the preamplifiers, the signal is routed to A to D converters using a custom-made high-end multi-core cable. These converters, the Merging Technologies Hoppy Mark II, are running at DSD-256. Why DSD-256, you may ask? You can read all about that on our blog, but it has to do with the sound quality and the transparency of the converter running at that specific sample rate. The DSD signal is recorded using Merging Technologies PureMix and then converted into PCM using Weiss Engineering Sericon sample rate converter. To ensure a true blind A to B comparison, we removed all of the metadata from the recordings and randomly shuffled the right and left pairs to prevent any bias towards one particular array or an A to B preference. On the musical side of things, we've had the absolute pleasure of working together with Bilal and Rabal from Syria. They performed parts of a song called Mahbub Kalbak, which I'm probably not pronouncing correctly, but we'd like to extend our heartfelt thanks to Bilal and Rabal for their patience and their mesmerizing music that they shared with us. The song was also recorded in its entirety for a single that you can find on TRPTK.com and all of your favorite streaming channels, so go check that out. Alright, now that we've covered our recording setup and the musicians involved, let's reveal the microphone cables that we use for this test. We understand that many of you have been eagerly waiting for this information, so let's dive into our contenders. All of the cables that we tested are balanced XLR cables specifically designed or suitable for microphone signals. Each cable was precisely 10 meters in length and their stereo companions were matched with a precision of less than half a centimeter. The first contender is the ProCap CAB901. It's an affordable microphone cable using ProCap branded cable and connectors, and a pre-built pair will set you back around €39. For €22, you can pick up the cable and the connector separately and go the DIY route. Next up, we have the TPR XLR cable by Grim Audio, built right here in the Netherlands. These cables feature Grimm Audio's own TPR cable with Neutrik connectors, and if you opt for the pre-assembled pair, it will cost you about €244 for 10 meters. However, if you have some DIY skills and are willing to build them yourself, the price reduces to approximately €212. The TPR cables are designed with a focus on high RF immunity and low microphonics, incorporating a special interface layer underneath the shield. Moving on, we've got custom-made TRPTK cables which we have been daily driving since 2019 already. These cables feature TRPTK's FA-AS22 cables with carbon fiber and rhodium connectors. And our pair was professionally made by TRPTK's engineering team, but if you're up for the challenge, you can build yourself a pair for around €1,921. These cables feature PCOCC copper and a sheath that contains damping carbon particles. Our fourth contender, provided by TRPTK and their Dutch distributor XFi, is the DAS 4.1 cable. It's got cryogenically treated, demagnetized PCOCC and DUCC copper, boasting about 10 times the purity of the FA-AS22 cables that we mentioned earlier. The cable is housed in a special carbon and nanoceramic compound that TRPTK says helps with interference. The cables are terminated with TRPTK's XLR connectors with NCF materials. These top-of-the-line cables will come with a price tag of about €7,656 if you're willing to solder them yourself. Lastly, we wanted to push boundaries by comparing two ultra-high-end and highly expensive cables. The Optimus Link Microphone Edition by Pure Cable, another Dutch product, was our choice for this extreme test. These cables use a proprietary and secret twisting technique and a construction with PCCCC copper. They're also using pure silk as a dielectric. The price for a pair of these extraordinary cables is an eye-watering €7,797, but these already come pre-built so you don't have to DIY them. With an almost 1,000-fold difference between the cheapest and the most expensive cable of the bunch, we believe that we've covered quite a wide range for this test. So let's get to the test itself, shall we? Before starting the test, we gathered some information from our listeners. We asked about their professional background to explore if those working in music or audio-related fields would perceive more subtle differences. We also inquired about their age to determine if there was any correlation at all between age and the ability to discern these variations. And additionally, we asked about the playback systems that they used, with hi-fi experts rating the subjective transparencies of these systems on a scale from 1 to 5. Understanding the subjectivity and the potential placebo effect in audio and cabling, we wanted to capture participants' expectations. We asked whether they anticipated hearing any differences and what those differences might be. And finally, at the end of the test, we asked how well the actual test aligned with their expectations. So let's move on to the A to B test itself. For each comparison, participants were asked 3 simple questions. 1, did they hear no difference at all, a subtle difference or a significant difference? 2, could they describe the difference that they heard? And 3, which sample, A or B, did they prefer? And now, without further ado, let's explore these highly anticipated results of our cable comparison test. Starting with the ProCab CAB901 versus the Grimm Audio TPR, approximately 68% of the participants reported hearing a difference, and among those, a slim majority of 57% preferred the CAB. When categorizing the responses, participants who mentioned timbre and detail leaned towards the ProCab, while those who mentioned imaging and miscellaneous aspects generally preferred the TPR by Grimm Audio. Interestingly, all professional musicians claimed to hear a difference, with nearly 75% of them favoring the TPR. On the other hand, approximately 70% of non-music industry respondents preferred the CAB901. Moving up to the comparison between the TPR and TRPTK's FA-AS22, 77% of all participants perceived a difference, especially those with more transparent playback systems. A slight majority of 52% favored TRPTK's FA-AS22. In the timbre category, about 57% of you preferred the FA-AS22, while the TPR held a slight edge in imaging. Details and miscellaneous aspects resulted in a tie. Interestingly, the preference between TRPTK and Grimm Audio seemed evenly distributed across professions, but among recording engineers who themselves use TPR cables extensively, there was an obvious preference for the TPR. Continuing the comparison between TRPTK's FA-AS22 and their flagship DAS 4.1, approximately 61% of you claimed to hear a difference. And out of those participants, about 61% again preferred the DAS 4.1. It garnered an overwhelming majority in the detail, imaging, and miscellaneous categories, and about 70% of you described the DAS 4.1 as having a superior soundstage and imaging, while over 80% of you perceived it as more detailed. Additionally, professional musicians, recording producers, and individuals in the hi-fi industry showed a strong preference for the DAS 4.1, while the preference among other professions was more evenly split. Now let's reach the pinnacle of our cable comparisons by pitting Furetek's top-of-the-line DAS 4.1 against Pure Cable's Optimus Link. Two cables with some pretty extravagant price tags. And surprisingly, 71% of you claim to hear a difference between the two. Specifically, 32% mentioned differences in imaging, followed closely by 30% in timbre, 25% in detail, and 11% in other aspects. As expected, these perceived differences are primarily reported by participants using more transparent systems, but overall the results indicate a general preference towards the Pure Cable in terms of soundstage and imaging, and for the Furetek regarding detail. However, the differences are so extremely subtle that drawing any conclusion at all becomes very challenging. Finally, we couldn't resist exploring whether there would be an audible difference between the cheapest cable in our lineup, the Pro Cab at about €40 a pair, and the second most expensive cable, the Furetek DAS 4.1, priced at almost €8,000 per pair. About 79% of participants reported hearing a difference between these two, with a 61% majority favoring the DAS 4.1. And now, you might be wondering if the 400-fold price difference justifies this preference, and I guess it all depends on who you ask. Because professional musicians unanimously preferred the DAS 4.1 in our test, as did the professional recording producers. However, individuals from the hi-fi world and other professions showed only a slight preference towards the DAS 4.1. Additionally, when grouping participants based on system transparency, those with systems described as medium to very high transparency displayed a preference of over 70% for the DAS 4.1. In contrast, systems described as low to very low transparency demonstrated a more evenly distributed preference. Dividing the results based on subjective sonic qualities, the largest categories were imaging, with 38% of respondents, of which almost 70% voted for the DAS 4.1, and timbre, with 24% of respondents, of which approximately 65% favored Furetek's latest creation. Alright, so what can we take away from this? Well, the night before we embarked on this cable comparison, I took a poll among our team members and I asked them what percentage of people, if any, they believe would hear a difference between these cables. And our recording team of 3 expressed some healthy skepticism, and I myself anticipated that no more than 10% of listeners would be able to hear any difference at all between these cables. Astonishingly, on average about 70% of respondents claim to perceive a difference between these cables. And among those listeners, about 42% describe the distinction in terms of imaging and soundstage, 29% say it's timbre, and 70% say detail. We also see that people using more transparent playback systems are more likely to report hearing differences. In my view, these types of differences may be so incredibly subtle that they become less discernible on less transparent systems. And additionally, since our recording and your playback function as one holistic system, in many cases these cables may not be the primary bottleneck within it. It wouldn't make much sense to invest in the best and the most expensive cable there is if there are already other bottlenecks within this system. Lastly, when we break things down based on profession, some really interesting stuff happens. So on average, approximately 90% of musicians claim to hear a difference between the tested cables, along with 78% of recording producers. Similarly, 80% of individuals in the hi-fi industry heard some differences, people from other professions about 61%. I believe this disparity is due to the training and the mindset of musicians and recording producers, because as a group we tend to focus on the extremely subtle yet tremendously significant minute details, and it's those details that aid us in refining our craft. And the same applies to people in the hi-fi industry. So when you've dedicated a significant portion of your life to discerning tiny nuances in sound, you obviously become more adept at detecting those subtleties in tests such as these. So the big question is, do cables actually make a difference? And it seems it all depends on who you ask. What's most important is that you trust your own ears and that you just enjoy the music. And in any case, I hope this video has been informative to you, because it sure has been an adventure for us. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.